During a dark and soundless day in autumn, when the clouds hung oppressively low, I had been passing alone on horseback through a dreary tract of country, and found myself, as evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how, but with the first glimpse of the building a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I looked upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into common life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. What was it that so unnerved me? I reined my horse to the brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay by the dwelling, and gazed down with a shudder even more thrilling than before upon the remodeled and inverted images. Roderick Usher had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter had lately reached me from him which gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a pitiable mental idiosyncrasy which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best, and indeed his only, personal friend, with a view of attempting by the cheerfulness of my society some alleviation of his malady. Although as boys we had been intimate associates, I really knew little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive. I was aware that his very ancient family had been noted for a peculiar temperament. I had learned, too, the remarkable fact that the entire family lay in the direct line of descent. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue, and the undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name which so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include both the family and the mansion. When I again uplifted my eyes to the house from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy that around the mansion there hung an atmosphere which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn in the form of an inelastic vapor or gas. Shaking off what must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangled web from the eaves. Yet all this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen, and there appeared to be a wild inconsistency between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the utterly porous and evidently decayed condition of the individual stones. Apart from this indication of extensive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building, made its way down the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet conducted me in silence through many dark and intricate passages. On one of the staircases, I met the physician of the family. His countenance wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet threw open a door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room was very large and excessively lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the black oaken floor as to be inaccessible from within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light made their way through the trellised panes. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The furniture was comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa and greeted me, and we sat down. Surely man had never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and pallid, hair of a more than web-like softness. These features made up a countenance not easily forgotten, and now in the mere exaggeration of these features lay so much of change that I doubted to whom I spoke. The now ghastly pallor of the skin and miraculous luster of the eye above all things startled me. The silken hair, in its wild gossamer texture, floated rather than fell about the face. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from a tremulous indecision to that leaden and perfectly modulated guttural utterance of the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium. It was thus that he spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and a family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odor of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light. And there were but peculiar sounds in these of stringed instruments which did not inspire him with horror. I must perish in this deplorable folly. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. In this unnerved condition, I feel I must inevitably abandon life and reason together in my struggles with some fatal demon of fear. Moreover, he was enchained by superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, and from which for many years he had never ventured forth, in regard to an influence which his family mansion had obtained over his spirit, an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets and of the dim tarn into which they all looked down had brought about upon the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, that much of the gloom which afflicted him could be traced to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed the approaching dissolution, of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said, with a bitterness which I can never forget, would leave him the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. As he spoke, the Lady Madeline passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an utter astonishment. Her figure, her air, her features, all in their very minutest development, were identically those of the Roderick Usher who sat beside me. As a door at length closed upon her exit, my gaze sought the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands and emaciated fingers, through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent affections of a partially cataleptical character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto she had not betaken herself finally to bed, but on my arrival at the house, she succumbed, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain. That the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted and read together, or I listened to the wild improvisations of his guitar, and thus, as a closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the house of Usher. I've spoken of that morbid condition which rendered all music intolerable with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth to the fantastic character of his performances, as well as the words of his wild fantasias, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with rhymed verbal improvisations. One of these rhapsodies I have easily borne away in memory. The verses were entitled, "The Haunted Palace." I well remember that suggestions arising from this ballad led us into an opinion of Usher's, which in its general form was that of the sentience of all vegetable things. The belief was connected with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been fulfilled in the order of their arrangement, as well as in the many fungi which overspread them, and of the trees which stood around, above all in the long undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn. Evidence of the sentience was to be seen in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable in that silent and terrible influence which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family and which made him what he was. I couldn't help thinking of it when one evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight, previously to its final interment in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. The brother had been led to his resolution by considerations of the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it was small, damp, and entirely without means of admission for light. Lying at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment, it had been used in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of a dungeon, and in later days as a place of deposit for powder or other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor, as well as the whole interior of the long archway through which we reached it, were carefully sheathed with copper. The door of massive iron had been similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp, grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and gazed upon the face of the tenant. The exact similitude between the brother and sister, even here again, startled and confounded me. Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured that the deceased and himself had been twins. and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead. The disease which had thus robbed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as is usual in all cases of cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, made our way into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. Some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal step. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eye had utterly gone out. At times, I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours, in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It's no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me the wild influences of his own fantastic superstitions. It was most especially upon retiring to bed late in the night of the 7th or the 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the dungeon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not while the hours waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all of what I felt was due to the phantasmagoric influence of the gloomy furniture, of the dark and tattered draperies tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off, I uplifted myself upon the pillows and, peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened to certain low and indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm, I knew not whence. Overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, I threw on my clothes with haste, when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterwards, he rapped at my door and entered bearing a lamp. "And you have not seen it? But stay, you shall." He hurried to one of the gigantic casements and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. There were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew against each other without passing away into the distance. Yet we had no glimpse of the moon or stars, nor was there any flashing forth of the lightning, but the under surfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous but distinctly visible gaseous exhalation which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. "You must not behold this," said I to Usher as I led him from the window to a seat. "These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena. Here, let us close the casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read, and you will listen, and so we will pass away this terrible night together." The antique volume which I had taken up was the Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning, but I had called it a favorite of Usher's more in sad jest than in earnest, for in truth it was the only book immediately at hand. And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and with blows made quickly room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand. And now Pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder that the noise of the dry and hollow-sounding wood reverberated throughout the forest. At the termination of this sentence, I started and for a moment paused, for it appeared to me that from some remote portion of the mansion there came to my ears what might have been the echo, but a dull and stifled one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. It was beyond doubt the coincidence alone which arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of the sashes and the ordinary noises of the still increasing storm, the sound had in itself nothing, surely, which should have interested or disturbed me. I continued the story. But Ethelred, now entering within the door, was amazed to perceive a dragon, which sat in guard before a palace of gold with a floor of silver, and on the wall there hung a shield of shining brass. And Ethelred uplifted his mace and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell down before him with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, the like whereof was never before heard. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that in this instance I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded I found it impossible to say, a low and apparently harsh but most unusual screaming or grating sound, the exact counterpart of what my fancy had already conjured up as the sound of the dragon's unnatural shriek as described by the romancer. Oppressed, as I certainly was, upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence, by 1,000 conflicting sensations, in which wonder and extreme terror were predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange alteration had during the last few minutes taken place in his demeanor. From a position fronting my own, he had gradually brought round his chair so as to sit with his face to the door of the chamber. He rocked from side to side with a gentle sway. Having rapidly taken notice of this, I resumed the narrative. But the good champion, having escaped the terrible fury of the dragon, approached valorously over the silver pavement to where the shield was upon the wall, which fell down at his feet with a mighty, great, and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had indeed at that moment fallen heavily upon a floor of silver, I became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic, and clangorous reverberation. Completely unnerved, I started convulsively to my feet, but the measured rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I hurried to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and I saw that he spoke in a low, hurried murmur. Bending closely, I drank in the hideous import of his words. Not hear it? Yes, I hear it. Many minutes, many days, many long hours have I heard it, yet I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Said I not my senses were acute? I now tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin many, many days ago. And now, tonight, Ethelred, the breaking of the door, and the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield, say rather the rending of the coffin, and the grating of the iron hinges, and her struggles within the cupboard archway of the vault. Oh, whither shall I fly? Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footsteps on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprung violently to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if in the effort he were giving up his soul. Madman! I tell you that she now stands without the door. The huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back their ebony jaws. And there did stand the Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, and the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained, trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold. Then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon her brother, and in her final death agonies bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors he had dreaded. From that chamber, and from that mansion I fled, aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting and blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure extending from the roof in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, this fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous, shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the house of Usher.